that others don't have. And, you know, all things considered, we need to know how the brain learns so that we can make choices and especially make the most of the time that we have to study. So myself and my team, we study cognitive science. So we study how the brain learns, and then we translate that into applicable study strategies for college level students. And with that said, that may give you kind of an idea of why I'm telling you what I'm telling you. The other thing I'll say is that I'm going to give you some tips and strategies today that may seem very different than what you're already doing. That's okay. That's really normal. I encourage you to really consider using them, even though they are a lot different than what you may be doing now, because again, this is research backed. It's how the brain actually learns. So we want to make sure that we're making the most of our time. So even though it seems like it's a bit cumbersome, the way that I'm telling you to study, you know, instead of the way you may have already been studying, it's actually going to make your life a lot easier in the long run. And I very much believe in simplifying for success. I think humans make things harder than they need to just naturally. So let's not do that academically. Any questions before we start? I'm going to hop over to the chat here. Yeah, Gerald, I'm seeing that applying those as adults with balancing is what I need help with. Absolutely. And I think, again, everyone's circumstance is different, but everyone can certainly use strategies to help them balance better and really make the most of all of these efforts. All right, let's roll. So the first thing I want to talk about today is what study habits we're going to ditch. So this is just kind of an overview of what you're going to learn today. So we're going to start right away with what are we going to ditch? What are we going to get rid of? A lot of these you may already be doing. So hang tight. I will explain each of them. I don't want to see anybody sign off like, oh, that's all I do. I see that a lot when I teach this in class. Students are like, you don't want me to what? And I'm like, trust me, hang on. Then we'll talk about evidence-based study strategies. So what are those strategies that we're learning about in learning labs that have been studied for decades by cognitive scientists and educational neuroscientists? We're also going to talk about memory as it relates to learning. I will say that there's a lot of misinformation on how memory works. And so, you know, you hear a lot of information, especially I think it was Hannah was saying bio A and P, like people say, oh, just memorize it, just memorize it. Well, that's not exactly how the brain learns information. It's certainly not how we retrieve it. So we'll talk about both ways that we forget and how memory actually encodes information. I think that the more you know about how the brain learns, the easier it is to approach your course material in a way that works best. And then we'll talk, if we have some time, we'll talk about implementing the study cycle, but I really want to focus mostly on these evidence-based strategies. So we'll just see how it goes. I like to be very interactive, so I am going to stop and ask for feedback. I'm going to really want, if you have something you want to share, if you just want to unmute yourself or toss it in the chat or raise your hand, I will certainly do my best to keep up with those. So don't hesitate to stop and say, what are you talking about? All right, ready? We good? Okay, first thing we're going to talk about is, I'm trying to figure out how to make this little banner go away. What I call the cycle of academic doom. Now, this may or may not have ever happened to you, but I think it's really important to consider. So when we get into these cycles, it can become, or when we get into these patterns, it becomes really cyclical and one thing builds upon each other. So sometimes we go to class, we're unable to focus, the material's brand new, I've never seen it before, I have no idea what they're talking about. So I start to zone out and say, all right, I'll just teach it to myself later. How many of you have been there before?
All the time.
Yeah. All right. And then, oh, cool. My dog is caught in my lamp cord. Awesome. Sorry about that. So, yeah, so we're in class. We're like, this is not making sense. I have no idea what this guy's talking about. I'm zoning out. I'll teach it to myself later. How often does that actually happen? Pretty seldom. So then we have, oh, was someone going to say something? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Okay. I'm going to move on. I'm so sorry if I'm not able to, I can't see who that is right now. But feel free to flip your audio again and just go for it. If I'm missing you, I'm sorry. So 2 weeks later, can't remember anything from that chapter. And what's interesting about not remembering information from one chapter is that information has continually built upon itself, right? So if we can't understand anything from chapter 2, it's really unlikely that we have not mastered chapter 4 at this point. So then the panic, the exam is quickly approaching. So you're cramming, maybe you didn't get much sleep. Obviously, this is just one example. There are a lot of ways that this can show itself, or we try to learn information last minute and we end up getting a poor grade. Tell me, someone, either put in the chat or say, where do you think this student could have done something differently? What would make the most sense to avoid this cyclical issue? It's pretty early, what I'm thinking.
Can you repeat the question? Oh,
Repeat the question?
Jinx.
Yep. So the question is, in this cycle where this student has had this, let's say about 3 weeks have gone by and it's just been absolute chaos just trying to learn this one chapter, what is something this student could have done differently early on in this cycle that may have avoided all of this?
Because the student probably would have outlined it or broke it down into small sections.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And you know what, Jermaine? Is that Jermaine? Yeah.
Yes.
What's interesting about that, number one, you're absolutely right. Like, we have to break it down. The brain can only digest so much at once. But the other thing is that it really needs to happen before class even starts. So honest to goodness, a 15, 20-minute pre-lecture prep can save you so much time and effort later. And the idea is not really to solidify the content or to have mastered the content before you get to class. The idea is to have an idea of what's coming so that you don't zone out. So that while you're in class, you're hearing the professor and you're like, oh, that's what that is. Oh, that's how that fits in. The brain will look to apply information that it already knows, even if what it already knows is that the brain doesn't know it. So sometimes you'd be like, oh, I didn't know that, but that makes sense. Truly, a pre-lecture prep can make a huge difference. At the end, I have a handout I can send to Amber if she wants to send it out to everyone about how the study cycle works. But that would be the first step, is really a pre-lecture prep, getting an idea of what's coming to just even prepare your brain to learn it. You would be surprised at how much more information you'll be able to conquer while in lecture. Any other questions about this or thoughts about this? Is it a little relatable, or has it ever been in the past?
This is Wendell.
Hi, Wendell.
I've never thought of that before, and I think it's a great idea, and I look forward to implementing that into my own studies. But I've never heard of that, and I think it's great.
The pre-lecture prep?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, good. You know what? I'm thinking I'm going to have time to go over it later, so hopefully you'll be here the entire time, because it sounds like, if that's something you all are interested in, it can take me 5 minutes to explain. And it's honestly, it's a 3-step process. It's what to do before, during, and after lecture. And it's just like a little bit of work on the front end, like that 15, 20 minutes of getting an idea what's coming, at least becoming comfortable with the material enough to learn it. And then what to do during lecture. You're already in lecture, so you're not, spending any extra time on that. and then what to do after lecture to make sure that the information is solidified and to really make sure you understand it. We're going to talk about that in a minute, because students study information that they don't understand relentlessly, and it means nothing to your brain. So we're going to talk about how to actually make sure we're understanding it. Wendell, thank you. All right, we're going to move on. So let's talk about some study habits to ditch. Stay with me. Why do you think I would tell you not to go over your notes? What's wrong with going over your notes? That sounds pretty innocuous.
Can I answer this one?
Oh, please, anybody can.
Yeah, and for me, I realize that sometimes I don't take great note skills. So if you don't take good notes, then what you're studying is not really helping you, because if you're not at speed, or if you didn't write the exact content to go back to it later, you kind of miss some parts or don't make sense. So it makes it harder to use as study material.
Yeah. So maybe our notes aren't very quality and they don't really show us the information that we're trying to learn anyway. So that's certainly one reason. Yeah, I see that a lot. What else? Let's say your notes are really good. Why would I still say, please don't prepare for a test by going over your notes? I know this is very metacognitive, right? So this is very like thinking about thinking and thinking about how I think and what I learn. And I mean, I'm asking you to think a lot outside the box, so it's okay if you don't have an answer right away. Going over your notes is actually a wildly passive way to learn. I could send you this PowerPoint and you could study it, you could go over it 10, 20, 30 times. But when I ask you a question on an exam or a quiz about it, and it's applicable in nature, like most exam questions are, you wouldn't have found that in the notes. Does that make sense? So it's a really inactive way of learning. Your notes can be an excellent tool, but they're not the only thing that you need. Even if you do them beautifully, even if you color code them. I have students who come in, they're like, I don't get it. I have 10 different colored pens and I still did bad on the test. Doesn't matter what color the text is. You have to understand the information. Cramming, listen, I'm just going to be really, really honest with you. Cramming is it's physiologically impossible to store and retrieve information in your long-term memory by cramming overnight. At best, you are going to recognize something instead of recall it and get lucky by, being able to check the right box or, have enough context clues. But it really is not possible to have information stored in your long-term memory where you want to pull it from, which is actually your neocortex, so like the outside of your brain, where you want to pull it from when you are taking the exam. The other thing about cramming is that your limbic system will take over, which is where your emotions lie. So we're very emotionally driven, and when we don't sleep, things get crazy in there. So what ends up happening is you will have a really hard time controlling stress. You'll have a hard time controlling hunger cues. You'll basically want to eat comfort food and nap and yell at everyone, and you won't even realize it. So just keep in mind that an overnight cram is probably one of the worst things that we can do. It's really difficult to also recall information the next day. So if you want to talk more about that later, we can, or if you have any questions about that, do let me know. Aimlessly highlighting, again, we're literally just changing the color. We're changing the color of the information. It doesn't mean we know it. It doesn't mean we understand it. Now, if you have a system where maybe you annotate your information, like blue means this is really important, and red, or nobody highlights in red, yellow means I don't understand this, I need to come back to it, and orange means, oh, this is a concept that I have an example for, and it's in the rest of orange. If you have like a key or something that helps you understand what the colors are, that's fine. But aimlessly highlighting information does not mean we understand it. Repeatedly rereading text. This is a tricky one. There is nothing wrong with having to reread information. I do it all the time. It's when we're getting through an entire chapter saying, I have no idea what I just read, doing it again, still not having an idea of what we just read. At that point, you really want to go back to what Jermaine was saying and really breaking it up. But even before we break it up, reading the title page is like this. I feel sorry for the title page of chapters, right? Like that first page where it explains the overview and maybe a little summary, and it tells you the objectives. Nobody ever looks at that. And that's the most important page, and we miss it. And so then we have nothing to apply our reading to. We don't even know what the title of the chapter is. I have students who are in bio and I'm like, well, what are you working on? I'm working on chapter 4. Okay, what's it about? I don't know, it's chapter 4. I can't get chapter 4. What's the title of chapter 4? I don't know. How do you know what you're applying it to? It can be so simple to just get an overview. It's like a movie preview, right? Just get a really quick overview of the chapter so that you can digest it and you can do those comprehension checks while you're reading through, so that you're not reading an entire chapter and then having to read it again. So I hope that makes sense. The most important thing, and this is kind of where we're going to go for the rest of the next, 15, 20 minutes, trying to memorize information without understanding the content. This is truly, in all of my years of working with cognitive science and study skills, I see this so often. And it's really, and trust me, I did it too, but badly. I wish I would have known then what I know now. It's probably one of the most dangerous things we're doing. So I'm going to launch right into what we should be doing instead, because I think it's going to really kind of solidify what I just said about trying to memorize information without understanding content. So before I get into the specific strategies of what you should do, I'm going to show you this formula that I have that I use with students. So a better formula for success, instead of cramming or going over your notes or whatever it is, in order to not try to memorize information that we don't understand, because your brain won't be able to pull it, again, it has nothing to apply it to, we have to test our comprehension. Before we create a study tool, before we do these short frequent reviews, which is what we should be doing next, and I'll get to that, we have to make sure that we understand it. If we don't understand it, we have to step back and find a way to gather the information, whether that be talking to your professor or using another source or maybe a tutor. Whatever the resource is, we need to make sure that we're understanding the information. Once you truly comprehend something, all the brain needs is short, frequent reviews. That's it. Once you truly comprehend something and it is consolidated into the long-term memory, you just have to spend a little bit of time with it. Short, frequent reviews. We're talking about concepts here. So I'm thinking like maybe the concept of whatever it is, like photosynthesis or whatever. And then easy to retrieve. The material is easy to retrieve. So the way that we pull information from our long-term memory, which is where we want it, is by, number one, making sure we understand it. Number two, doing the short, frequent reviews. And then it's easy to retrieve the material. So that's all good and fine. But how do we actually do that? So these are the evidence-based study strategies that we should be using. You guys ready? I'm going to talk about each of these. How are you feeling? My dog is being so loud. I am so sorry. She is just slamming me with all these toys and balls and everything and pulling on all my cords. So I really apologize. Okay, good. Wendell's feeling good. All right, awesome. Here we go. In order to, so the first step in that process, remember, I'm going to pop back up, test your comprehension. Do I even understand this? How do I do that? Can you summarize it in your own words, or can you teach it to other people? Correctly, I must say, correctly for both of these. If you can teach information to someone else, that's one of the best ways that you can test your comprehension. I am so sorry. That's one of the best ways that you can, Peggy agrees. She agrees. She knows what's up. That is one of the best ways that you can test whether or not you understand it. If I didn't understand how the brain learns, I would be really keeping my fingers crossed, hoping you didn't ask me any questions while I tear through this PowerPoint and not give you any examples. I know you've all had teachers like that, but we want to make sure we understand it. Can I teach it to someone else? I don't care if it's your dog, stuffed animals, your grandma, your kids, whatever. Can you teach it to someone else? If the answer is yes, then you truly understand it. Can you summarize it in your own words? Basically, I want to know if you can translate that information into your speak, right? That's how we test our comprehension. Then the next thing that we wanted to do is short, frequent reviews. Now you'll notice that concrete examples is in the middle there. Concrete examples can go both ways. And I'm going to give you all a website that I want you to save on your browser. Concrete examples can go both ways. So a concrete example is essentially explaining it, but also being able to give an example of it. Concrete examples can also be used as short, frequent reviews, but I'll give you a little bit more information about that. So we've tested our comprehension. Now what do we do with it? Well, there's something called space practice. It basically means the opposite of cramming. The brain needs space. The brain needs space to process information. The worst way we can give the brains that space is by adding input. So let's think of, if I'm studying, if I'm learning something, and I just did like 45 minutes of solid testing my comprehension, and then I'm gonna start creating a study tool, but I take a break. What's the worst thing you think I can do in that 10, 15 minute break that could override what I just learned? No, Peggy, that was not me, that was Peggy. What do you think the worst thing I could do is?
Would it be to do another activity or learn something different?
So you're definitely on the right track. Very specifically, the worst thing that you can do is get on your phone and start scrolling social media. Now, listen, I love technology. I get it. I'm on it all the time. But that is so much input. That is what other people are thinking. That's what other people are selling. That's what other people are putting out into the world. There's so much information, even when you're scrolling and not really processing what they're saying. Even if you're just scrolling and you're like, oh, you're awful, you're awful, you're awful, whatever it is, that's a lot of input. The brain needs space. We can give the brain space by taking a quick walk, eating a snack, petting your dog, talking to your kids. Well, my kid talks a lot, so I don't know if I would do that. But I mean, there's a lot. He's at his dad's right now. So luckily he's not the one grunting. It's just the dog this time. But it's really tricky because information can be interfered with easily. So you have to give the brain a little space. And we're going to talk about this more in the memory part in a couple slides, but I want to just kind of preface that now. Dual coding. This is one of the best ways to study. You know what? Let me pull this website up right now so that I can show you this. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second because I want to show you this website. The first thing I'll do is copy and paste it into our chat so that you have it. This is one of my favorite resources. So the learningscientist.org, and now I'm going to share my screen so that you can see it. Can you see this Learning Scientist website? Anybody? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So essentially on this website, where you'll want to go is just click on downloadable materials. You can download information by the strategy, right? So we have concrete examples, dual coding, interleaving, elaboration, retrieval practice, space practice. We're only going over 80% of those. But dual coding is really cool. This is essentially where, so you've tested your comprehension at this point. Dual coding is when you're using different modalities in which to study it or interact with it. So maybe you're using visuals and words. So maybe you're drawing, or maybe you're designing something. Maybe you're making a graphic out of it. Creating, once you understand it, I keep having to say that, creating even like an infographic, if you love using Canva or if you love drawing, creating something like that is 100% legitimate studying. It really helps you to learn deeper and to own it. So essentially it says here, look at your class materials and find visuals, look over the visuals and compare them to the words, look at the visuals, explain them in your own words. We've heard that before. Take information that you are trying to learn and draw visuals to go along with it. So maybe you're creating your own graphics with the information. There are a lot of ways to do dual coding. As you see over here, also, there's a bunch of other things that you can look at with regard to dual coding. But this is just one example of how you would use this website. If I go back, oh, we talked about concrete examples. Here's space practice. It explains different ways that you can space your practice to make sure that you're not overwhelming the brain, to make sure that you're able to digest it, to make sure that you're able to encode the information. Gives you a ton of tips on how to use space practice. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go back to our presentation, but I want you to bookmark this website. It has every evidence-based strategy that we teach and that we facilitate with our students here, and it also gives you a ton of examples. So is that helpful at all to have that as to access later?
Super helpful.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Okay, good. All right, I'm going to try to go back to, not that, this. Can you see brain-based studying? Okay. So we've talked about concrete examples, space practice, dual coding, retrieval practice. It's so much easier than it sounds. It's literally bringing something to mind. Okay, it's bringing something to mind. Retrieval practice is really important because it is not, this might be one of the most important things I say today. It is not what we put into our brains. It's how often we retrieve it that will strengthen those neural connections. You need those neural connections strengthened and strong as possible so that when you get to an exam, bam, the answer's there, bam, the answer's there. That really helps to strengthen those neural pathways, and retrieval practice is one of the best ways to do it. I would recommend starting retrieval practice right after lecture and just, like instead of leaving class and getting on your phone to read a bunch of other stuff that other people think, which we don't care about anyway, right? We're gonna maybe go take a 5-minute walk and sit down and just try to write down everything you remember from class, even if it's wrong. You wanna try to remember everything that you learned in class, and then you can compare it to what you really learned and see if it's right or wrong. That's a really great way to solidify information. Retrieval practice can be creating and doing self-quizzes. Retrieval practice can be flashcards if they're made in a way that makes sense. We don't want to write the definition on the front and the word on the front and the definition on the back. We want it to be applicable. So maybe it's multiple choice, maybe it's something you have to explain. All of that is retrieval practice, bringing information to mind. Any questions about that? This dog is out of control. Interleaving is the last thing. Interleaving is really good for things like math, foreign language, anything with a formula, astronomy, physics, chemistry. This is essentially saying that when you're studying for an exam, you don't want to study for a math exam or a calculus exam and do all the problems from chapter 1, then all the problems from chapter 2, because that's not how it's going to show up on the exam. We want to be able to do all, okay. You guys are gonna get a real show in a minute. She is tangled in my lamp cord and she's just gonna have to stay here for a second. I am so sorry. Basically what you wanna do is you want to try to practice information from different chapters because it's gonna be more likely that you'll be able to pull that information again from your long-term memory quickly on an exam, regardless of what page it shows up on. So try not to let the familiarity of things being sequential trip you up on exams. So just study a little from chapter 3, a little from chapter 4, so on and so forth. Any questions about that? I think it's really ironic that I teach about distractions in the brain, and this is happening. I'm so sorry. Oh, pandemic. All right, I see some stuff in the chat. Okay. All right, any questions before we move on to what we should be doing? Okay. It's really important to understand why we forget. So let's do this. I am going to, oops, no ma'am. I'm going to, next time I'm coming in the office, Amber, I'm so sorry. Jeez Louise. I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to share it a little differently. Okay. Let me try this. We're going to look at 4 common reasons why we forget. Can you see this brain being erased? That's a strange picture. I should probably change that. All right. Why we forget. So there are 4 main reasons for forgetting course material. I want to go over all of them with you. And then I want you to think about which one you relate to most. Some of you are going to have multiple ones. So interference, this is essentially what we talked about already. This is when either recently learned material interferes with your ability to recall previously learned material. So essentially, if I learn chapter 2, but I don't do short frequent reviews and I don't look at it again, and I learn chapter 3, 4, 5, then when I'm getting ready to study for the test, I may not remember what I learned in 2, and I may have to relearn that. And relearning information is really hard. So what could prevent that would be doing those short frequent reviews, doing the retrieval practice. When I say short frequent reviews, I literally mean I've already mastered this content. I am going to go through my flashcards while waiting for the bus, or I'm going to do the self quiz while waiting to pick my daughter up from school. Whatever it is, that just spending that time with it can be really helpful for those neural connections. Mental overcrowding. This is essentially multitasking, but not in the way that Amber was joking with someone here who was doing dishes earlier on camera. It's very different. Let me explain this. The brain cannot parallel process 2 pieces of novel or unique information at once. So what I mean by that, it's a very fancy way of saying, yes, you can definitely listen to music and take a walk, or listen to a podcast and drive, or do dishes and listen to a presentation sometimes. But you certainly cannot read a textbook and watch TV, or watch a game or something, or text while in lecture, because those are 2 new pieces of information and your brain will lose one. At best, you can task switch. So you really want to avoid having to task switch because you just end up doing a really bad job at both of them. So the brain, I will say that technology is way ahead of us in evolving, which I think is kind of good. The brain cannot and will not evolve as fast as technology. So if it feels like your brain has too many tabs open, it probably does. It probably does. All right, not allowing time to process information. This is a student who leaves class, and I have on here immediately hops on Snapchat. That's just kind of a common example that I use with with some more traditional college students, especially when I teach freshmen, but you may leave class and immediately have to take a work call or immediately have to rush somewhere to get your child or your parent or whatever it is. At least giving yourself the space on the walk to your car or the walk to your next class to encode the information is really important. New information that's learned is really fragile. We can lose it really quickly. Think about when you go to a party and you're kind of nervous or you're thinking about something else, or you want to go talk to this person over here, but then somebody comes and introduces themselves and you're like, oh yeah, hi. How fast do you forget their name? They're like, hey, I'm John. And you're like, I have no idea who you are. I don't remember your name after 5 minutes. Newly encoded information is really fragile. I would argue that it's not even encoded at that point. I would argue that it's heard. But we all know hearing it doesn't make it stick. And then the last one, this is the most common reason for forgetting for students. This is underlearning. This is where we can fall victim to the illusion of knowing. Has anybody ever heard of the illusion of knowing? It sounds kind of obvious. It's a little obvious. It's this concept that was, this is like educational psychological theory from 1986, I think. And it's essentially where you feel really familiar with information, maybe because you've been going over your notes all the time, which we talked about not to do in case you came late. Maybe it's because you see it often. So it gives you the illusion, this unwarranted confidence that you know it. Then you get to the test and you realize you don't know it. You've seen it a lot, but you don't know it. Does that make sense? We can avoid that, of course, by testing our comprehension before we even think about looking at our notes, right? So do we actually even understand it? The illusion of knowing it's a really, really dangerous and common situation that students find themselves in. So again, testing your comprehension, if you can teach it to someone else, there is no illusion. Does anybody have one of the, typically we'd go out into breakout rooms, but it's getting close to time and I want to be able to answer questions and I want to be able to give you a little bit more information about memory. Does anybody have any of these that they relate to the most?
I would say I think I relate to all of them.
Yeah, that
So
happens.
just mainly when you look at overloading, because like I work in between and school and travel in between.
Yeah.
That I realized when I took a quiz earlier this semester, the stuff I learned supposed to remember or thought I knew in winter semester, I didn't retain the information like I wanted to. And it was the hardest part, taking the quiz. Like I knew it, but I really didn't know it because I didn't study it. Or like
That's
you said,
tricky.
comprehension.
You almost had like the illusion of remembering. Like you did know it at one point, but
But
not.
processing so much information and going through, and like I said, taking as many classes I took, you lose it through having 6 classes in between that time.
That's a lot. That's an insane amount.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Anyone else have one that really stands out to them? Most students do relate to more than one of them, for sure. For sure. I definitely fall victim to the one where I don't allow time to process information. So if I go to a meeting and I'm on campus and I leave the meeting and then I'm running across campus to get back to my office and I notice my phone's blowing up, maybe like my Teams or my email or whatever, and I'll look at that and then there's a bunch of fires to put out there. And I completely forget what I was supposed to do right after that meeting or what I wanted to think about or how I wanted to, interact with the information. And I regret it a lot. I do, it's tricky. Whoa, brains. Okay, we're gonna finish up here. Let me see, share. Okay. Can you see my slides again? Awesome. So let's talk about how memory works. So we talked about how it doesn't work, which I think is really important to consider. But what we have to do, so the first part, I know I have retrieval practice. We'll talk about that. The first part is paying attention. That's such a vague term, to pay attention. What does that mean? I also have another 3-part theory that I use when I teach about paying attention. And it really is about, I am so sorry. There must be somebody outside minding their own business and Peggy wants to bark about it. It's a really good example of attention. Number 1, we have to resist distractions, which is super tricky. Number 2, I mean, distractions happen all the time, and we're programmed biologically to tune into them. It's survival. It really is. Again, that'll strike your limbic system. I hear Peggy and it, you know, I'm panicking because I feel bad that she's barking while I'm lecturing to you. But then it's my body and my cortisol and everything sees it the same as I heard a lion. That's evolutionarily how she's definitely not a lion, you saw her. But it's evolutionarily how we react, how our brains react. So we have to resist distraction. We have to sustain attention, which means focusing on one task, because again, the brain cannot parallel process 2 pieces of cognitive information that are unique or novel. And the other thing is that, and this is kind of the most important, there has to be some type of relevance. Why am I learning this? Let's say you hate one of your classes. Let's just say you don't like it. Let's say it's political science. That's what I hated in college because I didn't understand it. I didn't know political science meant government when I went to college. So you can imagine, I had no idea what they were talking about. None. I did not go to a good high school. They did not have government or civics or whatever you call it in the 90s. It was rough. So when I'm learning this information, I'm not just learning about the 3 branches of government. I'm learning like in depth, like a college level, content of that. I have nothing to apply it to. I had no relevance. You have to have relevance to what you're learning. You have to have some type of context. Does that make sense? I know I get wild with the attention part, but that's the first step. It's the most important step. When we pay attention and when we're actually able to truly hyper-focus on that one thing, and our brain is going to start encoding it. And it does that by finding familiar things. So again, like when I talked about that pre-lecture prep, like, oh, that's what that is. Oh, that's where that fits in. Making meaning, deeper learning, finding patterns, applying it to what you already know, that's all encoding. Now, here's the interesting thing, and then I'm going to leave time for questions. The storage and retrieval part is really fascinating to me. So the storage part, when we learn information or when we hear something or when we sense something around us, that automatically is happening in our working memory. So, or maybe what some may call our short-term memory, which is back here. It like hangs out in the hippocampus for a while, okay? But it needs to be consolidated into the long-term memory in order to be stored. Working memory is very short. They used to think many moons ago, like in the 50s, they used to think that we could hold 7 pieces of information in our short-term memory at once. It's like 2 or 3, and even that is fleeting. So we have learned so much since then. But with the storage part, does anybody know when information is consolidated from the short to the long-term memory? Anybody want to guess when that happens? I see something in the chat. Let me go look. Okay. Any guesses? Deep, low wave sleep. That is when memories are consolidated. That is when information moves from the short-term to the long-term memory and is consolidated, assuming there has not been interference. Okay, so you have sleep. There's a reason why we sleep. Sleep is, to me, sleep in the brain is fascinating. There's so much information about memory and sleep and stress and sleep and memory and stress. And that's kind of my field is, my specific study is the impact of stress on memory and learning, specifically for populations who have encountered long-term traumatic stress where their stress tolerance levels are just very, very high. So how the brain functions in those situations. And I'll tell you that without sleep, none of it matters. We have to prioritize quality sleep as much as possible. I understand everyone's circumstances are different. And then the retrieval. So again, retrieving information is the most important part. So we said earlier, ooh, oh no, I stopped sharing. Hang on, the window closed. We said earlier that, oh, I think it stopped sharing completely. I'm sorry. I just have one more little slide here. Okay. We said earlier that more important than what you put into the brain is how often you retrieve it. That is really, once it's stored in your memory, that's what's going to keep it there and going to keep it easy to access. So think of it as a very organized system where you're able to retrieve that information easily. Those neural connections will be strengthened. Dendrites will be popping. I don't know if that means anything to you, but it's something I like to say. And you're going to be able to really pull that information from your memory quickly and without stress. So with all of that said, I'm curious. Amber is saying, is this why I remember very little of my kids being babies? Yeah, honestly, probably that. And the fact that a lot when you have, now I only have one, you have two, that's a lot. That's double the amount I have. But when my son's 6 now, when he was a baby, he didn't sleep for a long time. He was a terrible sleeper. This is so messed up. I used to drop him off at daycare. And when I would get to work, I would take a picture of his empty car seat so that I could look at it later and remember I definitely dropped him off. It was so bad. Like I was that sleep deprived, and you have to thank God for cell phones, cameras, everything like that. So honestly, yeah, probably Amber.
So we're going on year 2 with the second one. Still very limited sleep, but it's better.
Oh, it's so hard. It's so hard. Is any of this helpful for anyone? I know I get really riled up and nerd out, and I'm sorry, but I just love this stuff so much. And
I
I
just
want
wish I could go back in time. I think about all the classes I took and I don't remember anything from them. Yeah.
I know it kind of breaks my heart. You mentioned you have to have relevance. Yes, Hannah, do you have a specific question about that? Can I elaborate? Absolutely. I'm going to use an example for you specifically because you told me you have A&P bio. Let's say that you don't like A&P bio. You don't want to be in there.
Mhm.
And you find the information to be really hard. Sometimes that relevance can just be understanding why you're learning it in the first place. So Hannah, are you pre-med?
Pre-nursing.
Pre-nursing, okay. So tricky program. When you are pre-nursing, you have so you're starting here, wherever you started. You may be up here, I don't know, but let's just say you're starting here. And then you have your goal of becoming a nurse, getting your BSN. When we encounter things that are really challenging, it feels like we're jumping from here to here. So from like freshman, I know you're not a freshman, but to nursing. It's really tricky to pay attention to things that we're not interested in, and the things that intimidate us or things that overwhelm us. And sometimes that relevance, all it really takes is understanding that this is a small step and a temporary step to get to that greater goal. Does that make sense? So like reading the chapter for A&P bio or understanding how it's going to apply to your career as a nurse, or seeing it more objectively and being able to understand the context of the information and how it can help you even in other classes.
Got it.
Kind of what I mean by relevance, like the why of it.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. It's the thing is, I kind of have to, I hate to say this, but there are some teachers that can teach, how to teach, and some are just too fast, and everyone's different, obviously, how they learn and retain information. So
Sure.
I feel like I go there and, and sometimes if I do have the time, I try to, pre-read the chapter or whatever I can, skim through some stuff before I attend lab. But when I'm there, it's just so fast. I feel like I'm just wasting my time parking, paying, and being there. And I was like, I could just be home and teach myself this. But I know that's something I have to do. So
and that takes away a lot of the relevance right there. When you're like, why even park? Like if that's part of your psyche right there, you're going to be frustrated and your limbic system's going to take over and you're not going to want to learn it. It's frustrating, right?
Yeah. I mean, I try to stay positive always, that's just, I am usually a positive person, but it's like, it's a drag because I can't learn with this instructor, and that's what it is. So
have you considered seeking, do they have supplemental instruction for that course? I think they probably do.
She does in lecture. I'm doing pretty good in lecture. In the lab portion of it, no, I'm not. I tuned in a few times and spoke with her too. And it's how lab is. It's all about memorizing and mainly that. But I'm going to, use some of this information for sure and try. So yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, I hope it's helpful. Keep in mind, whether it's A&P or anything else, information is information. If you can get together with classmates and teach it to each other, that could also be really helpful because they may be able to explain it in a way that you never considered.
That's true. Yeah.
Your perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. What other questions do we have? I know we're a little bit after 6. I definitely want to be respectful of your time.
I don't really have a question. I do want to make a statement because this information was definitely super key, because it's like, not only can I take this information and use it for class, but you definitely have my brain thinking about using it for just in general everyday living your life. So when you're looking at just test comprehension, and then you talking, even if you have poor habits in that area, and then for me having poor sleeping habits because I'm only sleeping in bursts, which means I'm not really organizing my brain to remember it long term. So it's just a compound effect. So when just hearing, you can start just tracing back like why you have to work 3-4 times harder. You really don't have to. You just have to do make some adjustments. So I definitely this information was definitely super something to get me to think about and making some adjustment lifestyle choices.
Oh, good. I'm so happy to hear that. And I'm always happy to talk further. If you have further questions or if you want to talk about, more about sleep or organizing your study, it's always my pleasure. It's interesting when you find a root cause and you're like, well, wait, now I have to step back. Now I have to step back. Now I have to step back. It's kind of like that cycle at the beginning talked about. Nice. Thank you so much. I appreciate that a lot. Amber, I should probably hand it back over to you in case they have questions for you.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was really, really helpful. Yeah, like I said, I wish I had known all this earlier, but moving forward, we have this as a tool to, like Jermaine said, just if it's work related, school related, it really applies to everything. So I did record the session, so I'll send it out later this week to everyone who's attended and anyone who RSVP'd to and didn't make it, as well as that link that Angela shared as well, so you can have that all in one place. If anyone has any questions for me, I'll stay on for 5 or 10 minutes. If not, feel free to head out. But thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Angela, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thank you so much. I'm going to